So now we are going to learn about the REST API. What is a Spring REST? Spring REST is a module of the Spring framework that simplifies the development of REST API services. What are web services? RESTful services follow the REST architecture principle using the HTTP method for the CRUD operations on the resources. How do you create REST compile controller in the Spring? By annotating a class with the REST controller and defining the request mapping methods with the request mapping and then get mapping and then post mapping, etc. What is uh, what is the purpose of at request mapping? At request mapping maps the HTTP request to specific handler methods in the controller. What is the difference between at controller and at rest controller? At controller is used to web MVC controller that return view, while at rest controller combines the at controller and the NAST response body to return the JSON or the XML. How can you handle the exceptions in the Spring REST API? By using the at controller advice to define the global exception and link for the controller. Now, what is Spring Boot? Spring Boot is an extension of the Spring Boot framework that simplifies the setup and then development of a new application. How do you enable the Spring Boot features for the REST API? By including the Spring Boot Starter Web the dependency in your Maven or the Gradle project. What is the role of the at response body in the Spring? Auto response body indicates the return value of this method should be bound to the web response body. How do you consume the REST API using the Spring? By using the REST template or the web client to make HTTP request and handle the response. What is the purpose of path variable? Path variable is used to extract the values from the URI path in a request. How do you handle the request parameter in the Spring? By using the request param to bind the query parameters to method arguments. What are HTTP status code? How do you return them? HTTP status code indicates the results of the HTTP request. You can turn them using the response entity or the response status. What is the difference between put and then what is the difference between put and patch in the REST? Mm, Put updates a resource entirely while patch partially updates a resources. How can you enable the cars in a Spring REST application? By using the cars origin annotation on the controller or configuring the cars in the WebMAC? How do you validate input data in the Spring REST? By using the annotation like validated, and JS or 303 validation annotation on the model field. What is Spring Hate OAS? Spring Hate OAS provides the support for creating the RESTful API by hypermedia link to navigate between the resources. Okay, how can you implement the pagination in the Spring REST APIs? Page by using the page request and page T with the Spring Data JPA to return the paginated results. What is Swagger? How can you integrate with the Spring REST? Swagger is a tool for documenting the REST API. You can integrate it using the Spring Fox or Spring Doc Open API. What is request body used for? Request body binds the HTTP request body to Java object for processing. How can you secure a Spring REST API? By implementing the OAuth 2, JWT, or basic authentication. And what is the role of the Spring application context? Application context provides the configuration and the lifecycle management for your Spring Bean. How do you configure the properties in the Spring Boot? By using the application.properties or the application.yaml file for environment specific configuration. What is DTO and why is it used in the REST API? Mm, yeah, data transfer object is a simple object used to transfer the data between the process, helping to decouple the entities from the API layer. How can you log request and then response in a Spring REST? By using the Spring built-in logging features or implementing a filter to log incoming request and outgoing response. What is the purpose of request header? At request header is used to access specific HTTP headers from a request. How do you handle the file uploads in Spring REST? By using the request param along with a multi-part file to process the uploaded files. What are Spring profiles? Spring profiles allow you to define the different configuration for the different environment. How can you version a REST API by including the version information? By including the where is that version? One more. Okay. Ah. By including version information in the URL, request header, or as a query parameter. What is the significance of attainable auto configuration in the Spring Boot? Attainable auto configuration enable the Spring Boot auto configuration feature, automatically configures the beans based on the class path. And how do you test REST API? By using the Spring Mock MVC for the unit test and integration test, along with the tools like the Postman and then JUnit. What is the role of the filter in the Spring Boot? So filter can pre-processor and then post-process HTTP request and then response, enabling cross-cutting concerns like logging and then authentication. Oh, how can you cache responses in Spring REST? By using the caching annotation like cacheable and then configuring a cache memory manager. What is the difference between the at component, at service, at repository? At component is a generic stereotype for any Spring managed component, while at service and at repository are specialized annotations for services and DAO layer respectively. How can you use the traditional annotation in the REST API? By applying the traditional to service methods to manage the transaction automatically. What is the Spring Data REST? Spring Data REST automatically exposes the Spring Data repositories as RESTful API, simplified CRUD operations. How do you implement the internationalization in the Spring REST? By using the resource bundle manage resources for message resolution and then configure the local specific messages. What is the purpose of at response entity? At response entity allow you to customize the HTTP response, including the headers, status code, and then body. How do you monitor a Spring REST API? By using the tools like Spring Boot Actuator to expose the metrics and then health check. What are the common tools for the API documentation in the Spring? Common tools include the Swagger, Open API, Spring REST API, REST docs for documenting and then testing the APIs. Now, SOAP. What is the SOAP? SOAP, Simple Object Access Protocol, is a protocol for exchanging the structured information in the web services. How does the Spring support the SOAP web services? Spring provide a framework for creating the SOAP web services using the Spring Web Services module. And then what is the role of at endpoint in the Spring SOAP? At endpoint is used to define a SOAP. At endpoint is used to define a SOAP web services endpoint that can handle the incoming request. How do you configure a SOAP web service in Spring? By defining a configuration class annotated with at enabled WS and configure the message factories and endpoints. What is WSDL file? Yeah, WSDL web service description language file describes the service operation, input, output messages, and protocols. How do you generate the WSDL file from the Spring? Spring can automatically generate the WSDL based on the annotated endpoint, classes, and message factories. What are JAX-P annotation? JAX-P Java architecture for XML binding. Annotations are used to convert the Java objects to XML and vice versa. How can you implement the SOAP service or SOAP services in the Spring? By creating the service class with the business logic and expose it to at endpoint and payload root annotations. What is at payload root? At payload root specifies the namespace and then local part of the SOAP is messages that the method should handle. How do you handle the SOAP exceptions in the Spring? By using the custom fault exception class and the SOAP fault annotation to define the fault response. What is a SOAP message? A SOAP message is an XML document that contains a header and a body structured according to the SOAP protocol. How can you consume SOAP web services in Spring by using the JAX WS proxy factory bean to create the proxy for the SOAP services and invoking in its method. What is the difference between the SOAP and then REST? SOAP is a protocol strict standard and then XML, while REST is an architectural style that can be various format like JSON, XML, and so on. How do you implement the security in the Spring SOAP? By using the WS security for the message level security and configure the security policies. What is the purpose of SOAP envelope? SOAP envelope defines the structure of the message and contains the header and body. How do you define a request response schema in the SOAP? By using the XML schema definition file to define the structure of the request and the response message. What is the service contract in the SOAP? A service contract defines the operations provided by the SOAP services, usually described in WSDL. How can you log SOAP's request and then response in the Spring Boot? By using the SOAP interceptors to log the incoming and then outgoing messages. What is a SOAP services? SOAP services is an annotation used to expose a service class as a SOAP service. How do you version a SOAP API? By including version information in the namespace of the WSDL or using the separate endpoint for the different version. How can you test your SOAP services in the Spring? By using the tools like SOAP UI or the Postman to send a request and then validate the response. What is the SOAP header? The SOAP header contains the optional attributes for the SOAP message, such as authentication token and then message routing information. How do you handle by data binding in the Spring SOAP? By using the JAX-P or XML beans to bind the XML to Java objects and vice versa. What is the role of the message factory in SOAP Spring SOAP? A message factory creates the SOAP message objects, processing request and the response. How can you add the custom headers to SOAP message? By using a SOAP header element, adding it to the SOAP message before sending. What is the function of a respond payload? Response payload indicates that the return value of the method should be marshaled into the response body of the SOAP message. How do you secure your SOAP message? By implementing the WS security for encrypting and then signing SOAP messages. What is the SOAP fault? SOAP fault is an error message sent by the server when processing the SOAP request failures. How can customize the SOAP error message response in the Spring? Creating a custom fault class and annotating with at SOAP fault to control the response structure. What is the Spring WS? Spring WS is a part of the Spring framework that supports the creation and consumption of the SOAP web services. How do you handle the asynchronous SOAPs request in the Spring? By implementing the asynchronous process using the async and configure the executor. What is the difference between the synchronous and the asynchronous SOAP calls? Synchronous calls block the client until the response is received, and while the asynchronous call allows the client to continue the process. Uh, how can you implement the transaction in the SOAP services? By using the at transactional to manage the transaction boundaries in the service layer. What are the bottom common design patterns used in the SOAP web services? Common design patterns include the service locator, data access object, and then factory pattern. How do you define the multiple operations in the SOAP services? By defining the multiple methods in the service classes and mapping them using the payload route annotation. What is the purpose of enable WS? Enable WS enable the configuration Spring web services in the application context. By configuring the message size limits in the Spring configuration or using the streaming technique. What is the use of XML namespace SOAP? XML namespace avoid naming conflicts and provide a mechanism for differentiating the elements. How can you handle SOAP versioning? By using the version to WSDL or providing the separate endpoints for different version. What are the advantages of using the Spring SOAP? Advantages include the easy of integration, built-in support for the AWS security, and the ability to leverage the Spring ecosystem for dependency injection and then AOP.